Well, good evening. My name is Kathy Cavallari. I'm president of the Westboro Historical Society. We welcome you to tonight's presentation on the adventure of book collecting with Kenneth Glass. If you're not familiar with the Westboro Historical Society, we date back to 1889. We have a headquarters house located at 13 Parkman Street in Westboro. It's an 1844 Greek revival home that was formerly the home of a famous sleigh maker in Westboro in the 19th century, Mr. William Sibley. We call it the Sibley House. And the house houses 3 centuries of artifacts of Westboro history dating back to the Revolutionary War. So in beyond COVID, we will be resuming tours of our artifacts. We give tours to everybody from scouts to 3rd grade school children. Along with that, we engage in research, and we are happy to present monthly educational programs to keep history alive and enjoyable for people. So tonight, I want to welcome you all and welcome our guest speaker, Kenneth Glass, proprietor of the internationally known Brattle Book Shop in Boston's Downtown Crossing. Let's see, before I go any further, I want to say this program is co-sponsored by the Westboro Public Library Center for History and Culture, which is managed by history librarian Anthony Vaver, who's with us tonight also. And we appreciate their participation in this as well. So Ken is going to be discussing the value of old and rare books, some favorite finds he's made, the joy of the hunt. He is a rare book specialist and appraiser who's frequently seen on national TV, including Antiques Roadshow. He's also going to tell us a little bit about the history of his bookshop, which dates back to 1825, and he is a 2nd-generation owner of that shop. I want to mention that during the talk, if you have questions, we ask you to please put the questions in the chat. And the questions will be addressed after the presentation. And then after some questions, Ken will also, offer free verbal appraisals of some books that have been submitted. And he may discuss them during the presentation as well. So let's see. I will be checking the chat during the presentation. So, if anything's urgent, I will ask, but we'll probably address them mostly at the end. I also want to mention the program is being recorded for Westboro TV for later rebroadcast. And if you don't wish your image to be recorded, we just ask that you please turn your video off. Thank you. I want to mention that Ken is a member of quite a number of antiquarian bookseller associations of America. Let's see. The main antiquarian bookseller of America, the International League of Antiquarian Booksellers, the New England Antiquarian Booksellers of America. He also belongs to Massachusetts and Rhode Island's Antiquarian Booksellers. He's part of the committee for the Boston International Antiquarian Book Fair and the Boston Society. He's also a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and also serves on the board of overseers of the USS Constitution Museum. So he's very well qualified. And I would like to also mention that the Brattle Book Shop is also the recipient of several Best of Boston Awards in the categories of Best Bookshop or Best Antiquarian Bookshop. In addition, it has been included as in a list as one of America's best bookstores. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Kenneth Glass.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here tonight. I start all of these Zoom lectures by saying I'd rather be there, but this is what we have. And hopefully fairly soon, we'll start getting a little bit more back to the live presentations. What I do in a talk, the talk will last for about 45 minutes to an hour. When I'm actually talking, maybe half an hour, 40 minutes, and then I like to do 15, 20 minutes of question and answer. A few people submitted appraisal questions. I'll do a couple of those. But anything that I don't get to, you can always email, call, mail, whatever, and I'll do them after the talk tomorrow at convenience. So everything will get done and answered. one of the things that I find when you do on Zoom as opposed to live, it takes a little longer and so on. And I get to work very, very early in the morning. I I get here at 5:30 in the morning usually. So when I'm doing a talk, when it gets to be around 8 o'clock, I give a little leeway, but my wife usually says, well, I only work half a day, 12 hours. Uh, but let me give you a little bit of my background of my store and the history. The history does go back to the 1820s, but for all practical purposes, it was going out of business in 1949. My father was getting married. My mother had $500. And with that, they bought half interest in the Brattle Book Shop. And it's always been in Boston. People call us from Harvard Square on Brattle Street. Where are you? We tell them we're downtown. When my father first bought the store, there was a little side street in what was Scully Square called Brattle Street. To make it even more confusing, the street doesn't exist anymore. It's where Boston City Hall Plaza is now. And my father built the store on his great love of books, his hard work, his knowledge, and he was also a bit of a character and a showman. And we've had 7 different locations over the years, mainly due to urban renewal. But when it was a planned move, every time we moved, my father would move the best books to the new location and then run sales, half price, dollar, 50 cent, quarter dime. Last day of the sale, though, everything was free. He would literally have hundreds of people line up with bags, packs, satchels, whatever. He'd ring a big bell. People would go charging into the store, grab whatever they could grab. 5 minutes later, he'd ring the bell again. That group would leave. The next group would come in. And he gave away over 250,000 books that way. Now, the last time he did this was in 1969, and we were moving from the end of Washington Street to West Street, where we are now. And at the end of the giveaway, there were books left over. And like I said, my father was a bit of a character and a showman. If you can sort of picture this, he hired a covered wagon with a cowboy and a horse team. And on the cover of the covered wagon, it said, "Go West, book lovers, go 5 West Street, Brattle Book Shop." They filled it up with books and they drove it from the end of Washington Street near Boston City Hall, up Court Street, down Tremont by the Boston Common to where West Street is, and then back down Washington, with my father sitting in back, throwing books out the whole way. Now, the superintendent in charge of traffic was a friend of his, told him he could do it all morning, but within an hour, the city was in an absolute standstill. They told him to stop. He didn't care. He'd gotten his point across. And we've been on West Street since then. When we first moved in, we were in a 5-story, 150-year-old wooden building, absolutely crammed full of books. In February of 1980, I got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning. The building was on fire. It literally burnt to the ground. I mean, it was 100% gone. But we wanted to continue to keep going, not go out of business. We found a storefront a few doors up the street. We rented folding tables. People who either sold, gave us, donated books. Kevin White, who was the mayor at the time, came down with a carload. But the main thing was just keep going. So in a month, we reopened. 4 years, we slowly but surely rebuilt the stock. 4 years after that, we bought the building we're in now, which is, again, a few doors down on West Street. And it's sort of the old Dickensian type of store. Outside stands at $1, 3 and 5, 2 floors of general used books, a 3rd floor with rare books, autographs, manuscripts, leather bindings, and so on. In that type of business, the large, old, general secondhand bookstore, especially in the inner cities, is a dying business. It's not dying because people don't like books, buy books, sell books, read books, but particularly in the cities, property value has gone so high, that rent has gone so high, and used and old bookstores are not the most efficiently run businesses in the world. And one right after the other, they've been going out of business. Now, like I say, we bought our building in the early 80s. I hope to do this for years to come. I have daughters in their 30s. I don't know that they're going to come into it the way I did. And I've done this all my life. My parents say my first word was book. I honestly don't know, but I'm sure they were talking about them all the time. Maybe it was. And then I worked after school in elementary school, junior high school, summers during college. I have a degree in chemistry from the University of Massachusetts. I was going to get a doctoral degree at the University of Wisconsin. But in 1973, I needed a year off. My father's health wasn't that good. that year now is almost 50 years. And I don't regret for a minute that I'm doing this and not in a laboratory somewhere. And a lot of the fun of it is the people that you run into, the books, the items. And what I do in a talk is I'll tell a lot of anecdotes and stories of places I've been, people, and so on. And it's not even just the customers and the people we buy from, but sometimes it's even the people we hire. This was a long time ago, but we hired a new employee, and he had been working at the store a few days, maybe it was a week. And I was there, and the man came in, and he asked for an obscure author named Doniford Yates. I knew who Doniford Yates was. We went over to the section, looked, didn't have anything. I said, "You want to leave your name?" He said no, but he'd check again. He left. My new employee comes up to me and says, "Does that man come in here often?" And I said, I really wasn't paying attention, but no, I didn't, I haven't seen him in here. He goes, "Oh, well, that was JD Salinger. I used to date his daughter." And
Wow.
so you never know. And this employee worked for us for a long time, but a few weeks after that, he gave a memorable introduction to somebody. And it's one I haven't forgotten. My wife had 4 tickets to a Celtics game. We said, "Hugh, do you want to go to the game?" He said, "Sure, but give me the 2 tickets. I'll meet you there." We get to the game. He's sitting there with a woman. He looks at us. He goes, "Oh, this is my wife, Mickey. We're getting divorced tomorrow." I mean, what do you say to an introduction like that? But it's one of the more memorable ones. And that's a lot of what the fun is. It's the people, the places, the characters. And matter of fact, I'll tell a few stories about estates and places that we've gone. Uh, I was out of the store and I got a call and a message that a Mrs. Fisher had called us. And I called her back and she said, "Oh, yes, my father died in Providence. He has 500 art reference books. We want to get the best price we can. We're inviting a number of dealers down to bid on them. Would you be interested?" And 500 art reference books sounds like a good library. Providence is only an hour away. We go all over the Northeast, all over New England. So that was no problem. Their house was on Benefit Street in Providence, up near Brown University. Got to the house. It was a large old colonial house. I get led through the house into a courtyard, into a garage. Second floor of the garage, they had 5,000 books. Well, it turned out her married name was Fisher. Her father's name was John Nicholas Brown. Family founded Brown University, one of the wealthiest families in the country. And after about 6 months, I bought 80% of the books I wanted. I was pleased. She was happy. She said, "My mother has a lot of books. Most are being given to the university. Some are being sold at auction. But would you like to go to Newport to take a look at the books there?" Well, their house in Newport was one of the mansions on the ocean. I mentioned this to my wife. She decided to come with me on this deal. And one of the fascinating parts about it was being in one of those mansions. It was still being lived in as a house. And at one point, wandering from the basement to the attic, all on my own, without a tour guide saying, "Come here, go here, don't touch this," and just walking through the whole place. It was fascinating. Another time I got called to Newport to do an appraisal. Now, when I do talks like this or all day long, we do hundreds of free appraisals. Matter of fact, my goal is that whenever you think of an old book, you think of me and the Brattle Book Shop. And one of the ways I feel I can do, I don't care if you think of 10 others, but one of the ways I feel I can do that is by offering to give out as much free information as reasonable. Anyways, another mansion in Newport, not quite as big as the Brown family, but this was the Perry family. Commodore Perry, Oliver Hazard Perry, and what they had was a whole stack of papers from the War of 1812. During the war, their family were privateers. Well, they're privateers if you're on our side. They're pirates if you're on the other side. It's all the way you look at it. But they would sometimes capture a ship and realize tens of thousands of dollars profit. In 1812, that was an incredible amount of money. Then one day, one of the ships got hit. There was a battle. It got hit. The captain got hit. He lost his leg. 3 days later, there was a tiny entry at the bottom of a page, and it said, "Captain, $5 bonus, loss of leg." And that was the last you heard of the captain. Now, there is, I'll tell a couple of more stories about houses, but there is one that I went to that's very local to Westboro is actually in Southborough, so very close. I got a call. Now, when people call us up, usually the first thing we ask is, how many books do you have? And usually the first answer to that is a lot. And then we ask, what kind of books do you have? And the usual first answer to that is fiction and nonfiction, which is every book ever done. So we try to narrow it down. Nowadays, we'll even say to people, take pictures of your bookshelves, digital pictures, and send them to us. But usually on the phone, when we ask what kind of books, if people can't give us any type of answer, it's usually not a good sign. And we're sometimes reluctant to make an appointment. But I was asking these people and just trying to get information. They seemed nice and on the phone and weren't giving me any information. And they said, well, they have 12 boxes in the basement. And then they said, well, one of the boxes is almost full of books on our family genealogy. And I immediately thought, well, gee, if they have a number of books on their family genealogy, most people who have printed genealogies have more money. And if they have more money, maybe go. So anyways, I get to this house in Southborough. It's an older farmhouse type of place. Get led down the basement. Now the basement is a big concrete floor. And on it isn't 12 boxes, it's 12 crates of books. Now, you're in a basement, it's somewhat dark. You're feeling, you're waiting for maybe a mouse or a rat to run by, and, it was dark. And we had to get out crowbars to open these boxes up, and you could hear them creaking up. They're filled with newspaper wrap books. You start unwrapping the newspaper, and the newspaper was all from 1930. So that means these books had been probably sitting on that concrete floor. And the reason the people had called us in the first place was, turned out some of the plumbing was in that concrete floor and they had to fix it. And the only way they could fix it was digging into the concrete, but these 12 crates of boxes were on top of them. So we started opening, and it was amazing. There were actually some really nice books on medicine. And, probably 10 of the 12 boxes were old books. Turned out one of the buildings at Mass General Hospital is named after their relative who collected these books. So let me just put it this way. They more than paid for the plumbing fixture and the floor fixture. But it was one of those, I can still hear the box creaking open. And usually that's not the greatest, but these were good. Another time, when my father was still alive, and he died over 35 years ago, we got called by a lady, vague about her name, what she had, who she was, but she lived in Sharon and sounded like it might be good. Little ranch house, paint peeling, weeds growing. You get there, you go, oh, geez. She answers the door, elderly, and you walk in and there are just gorgeous antiques everywhere. And she starts telling us that she was from the Boston area, but she had married the Prince of the Ukraine, the cousin of the Tsar of Russia. He had escaped just before the Russian Revolution. And she told story after story about the Russian nobility in Europe, all the court intrigues, all the goings on. Her books were lousy, but the stories were absolutely wonderful. And when we first got in, on one of her walls, she had 10 watercolors. They were probably like this, pastoral European scenes. And I looked at them, I thought they were nice. The more she talked, the more I looked at them, the nicer I thought they were. And I finally said to her, those 10 watercolors, they're really nice. She turned around, matter-of-factly said, oh yes, they're all Turners. So she had 10 original Turner watercolors, probably $1 million worth of painting. It was like, oh yes. So you never know the people, the places, the characters. As a matter of fact, speaking of one of the characters, about 20 years ago, we went to one of our customers' 100th birthday party. Now, when you go to a man's 100th birthday party, and he tells you he just got back from Barcelona, he's going to give a talk in Florida, and he's been asked to lecture in Tokyo. And I finally said, wait a minute, you're 100 years old. Don't you think Tokyo is an awfully long way to go? And he said, well, when I used to work, it took me well over 25 hours to get to Chicago. He says, I don't think Tokyo is a whole lot further than that nowadays. And here's a man who can tell you about sitting down to dinner once with Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. And he obviously was much younger, and he said he was looking forward to this talk and all the learning and insight he was going to get. He said he was excited. He got there a little early at the table. 5 minutes later, Ford came in and sat down next to him. 15 minutes later, Edison came in and sat down opposite. And Edison was old, elderly, one of those big horns for hearing. And the first thing he said was Ford turned to Edison and yelled, "My Tom, you look very good." And Edison turned to Ford and yelled, "It's the Carter's little liver pills." This man said all night long, all they did was yell about Carter's little liver pills. And he said next time he wanted to learn something, he went to the library. One last story about estates and people. We get hundreds of calls at the store. People want to know, do you have a book? Can you get a book? How hard is it to get the book? Does the book exist? And most of those questions, either I or the people I work with can answer right off the top of our heads. Some take a little research. Occasionally, you really have to do some work, but that can be fun. Every once in a while, though, you get a call that really stands out. And this was a number of years ago. I answered the phone, "Hello, Brattle Bookshop, can I help you?" Lady, elderly, thick Irish brogue. And the first thing she says is, "President Kennedy slept with me." So you have to admit, it gets your attention. She stops and waited for it to sink in, and then she went on and explained that she had worked for the Kennedy family. When he was 2 and 3 years old, he used to fall asleep in her arms. So he did sleep with her, but maybe not what you first think. And what she had was a whole series of handwritten letters from the president. Now, presidential letters of any type have value. Handwritten letters from later 20th century presidents were very hard to get, rare and expensive. She wanted to get an offer on them. I was skeptical, but I thought she'd be fun to meet. I went out and met her. The letters were fabulous. I gave her what I thought was a tremendous offer. Much as I suspected, though, there was no way she could sell these letters. They were part of her life. I left a note behind. As far as I know, her family still has them, probably where they belong. But it's a lot of fun. And one of the things that when people collect, you never know what they're going to be interested, what they want. And one of the great joys for me of this, doing this, is some of the things that I run across, some that are, I know, some that I get to buy, some that, I just get to touch. And there are a lot of things that you really, it's amazing. I'll tell you about a few of those, and then I'll talk a little bit about collections. I also, about some of the presentations I've given. I got a call from a library to do an appraisal. They were loaning a document from their library to another library, and they just needed insurance appraisal for it. And I said, and I was a member of the museum, and I said, sure, I'll do it. I'll do it for free, no problem. But I don't want to do it from your website. I don't want to do it from a copy. I want to see the original. They said, fine, just come by. So I came by, and I'm sitting there holding a 4-page handwritten account of Paul Revere's ride by Paul Revere. I mean, sitting there and, him a week later describing what happened. I mean, the fact that something like that even exists, and you get to touch it and feel it. And even though I deal with material like this, it still can send a chill up your spine. Another time, this was again for a university, I got called for an appraisal, and I don't know how many of you are in the sciences, but my background for college was chemistry. And they had the man who founded it's Babson College. The man who founded, Roger Babson, was a devotee of Isaac Newton. He had a huge collection of Isaac Newton, but there was one particular item. It was a first edition of Principia Mathematica done in the 1600s, but it's the foundation of modern mathematics. A good copy of that book now sells in the $1 million range, but this was Isaac Newton's copy that he made marginal notes and annotations in the margins. It would be worth millions. Now that book went from Babson to a library at MIT, and now is out in the Huntington Library in California. And I went to the Huntington Library before the pandemic, and one of the things I made sure to do was to get to the exhibit where that book was, look in the case and say to myself, I held that book. I touched it. It was a lot of fun. And my children, when they were growing up, I used to bring items home to them. And, it was like they were so nonplussed. I'd bring home an Audubon, original. And they'd go, another Audubon. I mean, Dad's bringing home this old thing and so on. But right after 9/11, I had been in a house in Belmont and I went up in the attic, and in a trunk, in the bottom of the trunk was a manila envelope, an old manila envelope. And in that manila envelope was 10 letters of Thomas Jefferson. There were letters of John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Madison Monroe, and so on. They were great, but there was one letter in particular I brought home. It was just after 9/11, and I showed it to my daughters, and I knew I had something. The letter was from the War of 1812, and Jefferson was talking about what to do about traitors and terrorists. I mean, actually using those words. A lot of Americans in 1812 had wished that the English had won the Revolutionary War, and they were at war now with the English again, and they wanted them to win again. And Jefferson considered them traitors and terrorists. But what he said was they should get the full protection of the law and absolutely nothing else, which after 9/11 was really interesting. My daughters asked if they could bring it to school for show and tell. I said, maybe not a good idea, but it's amazing. And it's amazing what people are interested in. We bought a collection of cookbooks, and not everything has to be high priced to be fun. We bought a collection of cookbooks. There's about 2,000 cookbooks going back to the 1700s. A really great collection. But there were 2 boxes of these pamphlets, sort of like bake a chocolate recipes, how to make Jell-O, how to cook with a mix master. And a lot of them are very colorful. They're not high priced, and they take a lot of time. And we had this great collection. And I said to one of my assistants, look, put the boxes out at $1. There were some real bargains in there, but we'd rather spend our time on the better books. About 2 hours later, this man comes running in with one of the pamphlets, and he is thrilled. He's beside himself. He goes, I've been looking for this for years and years and years, and it's out there. It's $1. And I mean, he's just so happy. And then I look at it. The title is Coconuts and Constipation. So you never know. You never know what someone's going to want. One of the questions once in a while that comes up is, do I collect books? And my basic collection answer is no. And the reason I say that is when I grew up, my father used to bring home 4 or 5 books a day. Do that for 30 or 40 years. And you can imagine what our house looked like. He always meant to read a chapter, maybe an introduction, maybe the flap on the book. But anyways, they piled and piled. So I tend to read a lot. I read a lot about books, book collecting, Boston history, and then John Grisham, Stephen King. I have a great John Grisham story too, but might not get to it. But my wife had a huge collection of 1,000 books on jazz. A few years ago, we had a customer who loved jazz. She decided to sell it. She was afraid that if she waited 10 or 15 years, less and less people would know who these musicians were. So she thought it was a good time to let it go. She now has a collection of Anne Frank. She has about 10 different editions. It's not a serious, although there are first Dutch editions, which are valuable, but if they come to her, she gets them. But there is one collection we had at home that started as a bit of a joke. I got a book one time, and it had a picture of a toilet on the cover. Now, before they had dust jackets widely, a lot of books had very decorative covers. The idea was when you walked into a bookstore, if the cover was very decorative and caught your eye, there's a good chance that you'd see it and more chance you'd buy it. And there are people who collect these kind of books. You can go to library sales, historical society sales, bookstores, auctions, flea markets, and pick up lots of them very cheaply. Some are expensive, but you can pick up lots cheaply. And individually, they might not seem like much, but graphically, they can make quite a collection. Anyways, I got the one with the toilet on the cover. The title was Flushed with Pride, The Life of Thomas Crapper, Invented the Toilet. I brought it home. I showed it to my wife. She took one look at it, said, we have to put that in the bathroom. We did. A couple of days later, we got another book, and it had a big eye staring out of the book. And the title was We Never Sleep. It was a history of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, but with a big eye staring at you. I thought, put that in the bathroom too. Now, this is a little half bathroom. There's no shower, no steam. Next thing you know, this is sort of an idea of what the type of books are. We have 400. We built bookshelves. Now there's 300 or 400 of these style, decorative Victorian style books. People walk into our bathroom. They're a little taken aback. Loads of reading material. And one of the rules of the collection is that nothing can be valuable, because every once in a while a book falls off the shelf and you can imagine where it ends up. Another thing that happens when people call about selling books is usually we tell them the first thing you need to do is go through it and decide what you want to keep, what's sentimentally important. That's usually the hardest part about it, because, you know, oh, wait a minute, so-and-so gave me that one, or I remember when we were here. And usually I can go in and look incredibly quickly because I don't have that attachment. When I went through my father's library when he died, it took me, what would have taken me not even a day, took me about 3 months because I was looking at everything. But and I didn't know this, but he had a box. And for those of you who know the old movie stills, so they're like 8x10 pictures from the old movies of the stars of the background. He had a box full of those. And I'm going, gee, I didn't know he cared about the movies that much. And so there were probably 500, maybe even 1,000 of these movie stills. And then I started looking at them and I realized why my father had that collection. Every single one of those movie stills had a book in it. It might be the actor holding a book. It might be the background had a book. There might have been a book on the table. There might have been a picture in the background and the person in the picture in the background was holding a book. Somewhere, the wallpaper might have had a book on that, but somewhere in every single one of those movie stills, there was a book in it. And I sold it to a friend of my father's who really loved the collection. It's in a good place, but I regret it. Once I realized I should have kept it, but in any case, you know, I can go on and on. I'll tell a few stories about Antiques Roadshow, which I hope all of you watch. Matter of fact, probably I'll make sure to try to get done by 8 o'clock so you can watch the new Antiques Roadshow. I'm not on it this week, but otherwise, I tell you, I'll get off definitely. But Antiques Roadshow, for those of you who do see it, is a lot of fun. I hope you like the show, but it's a lot of fun to do. I mean, we travel all over the country. Now, one of the things people really don't realize is they don't pay us anything. We pay our own plane fare, we pay our own hotels, we pay our own meals, we pay everything. Of course, we also get good public relations out of it. And also, why would I ever go to Fargo, Boise, Omaha, and anywhere you go in this country? If you have any time at all or any effort, it's all beautiful, it's gorgeous, and the people are nice. Don't talk about politics and religion. The people are wonderful, and it's given me the chance to see it. But the way that show works is you appraise on a day, and you start 3,000 to 5,000 people come to a show when it's not COVID. 3,000 to 5,000. Each person has 2 items, so there's 6,000 to 10,000 items that come in. You appraise from about 7:30 in the morning till 6, 7 at night sometimes, almost nonstop. They select about 100 items, some short, some longer, and that makes up about 3 hours of television. And there's no guarantee that as an appraiser that you're going to get on something that's going to come that's not only interesting, but the people are interesting. There's nothing, to say that it's not pre-selected. And so looking at it from an appraiser's point of view, obviously, when you watch it, you go, that person, boy, maybe they've got that, they've just won the lottery with that item. Or some people like when they get found out that it isn't what they thought it was. But for an appraiser, the way we look at the show is we're hoping to get on TV too. I mean, we've paid all that way, we've spent all that time. And the ideal thing for an appraiser at the Antiques Roadshow is someone comes in about 7, 8 in the morning. They have something interesting. and you call a producer over. The producer says, yeah, go on TV with that. By 8:30, 9 in the morning, you've taped something. So the rest of the day is really simple. You've already been on TV, you've done it. Whereas if it's 4 or 5 in the afternoon and you haven't taped, you start getting very nervous. Maybe I'm not going to get on. So in one of the cities, it was Kansas City, actually, a man comes in early in the morning to me, and he has a few things signed by Pope John Paul II. I mean, they were nice. They weren't anything great, but they were nice. And I'm going, well, that's normal. But then he pulls out some photographs. Turned out he was the pilot who flew the Pope and his entourage around the country when they were here. And there's this fabulous photograph of the pilot in his pilot's uniform sitting in the pilot's seat in the cockpit of the airplane. The Pope in his full vestments is standing there with one foot on the ground, the other foot raised up behind him, leaning over the pilot's seat. Now, normally when you see the Pope like that, he's standing there very formally. People are in front of him, bowing down, kissing his ring. And it's a very formal. Here he is. You see his leg up in the air. You see, and he's reaching over and signing the pilot's Bible. And I'm saying to myself, this is fabulous. You know, TV, it's going to be a great story. He told stories about the entourage and everything going on. And I say, great, let me see the Bible. And he goes, oh, I didn't bring that. And I go, well, can you go home and get it? And he goes, oh, no, it's in a safe deposit box and it's Saturday. We can't do that. And I'm going, oh. I ended up taping something later in the day, but it was one of the ones I remember most because it didn't get there. But the Antiques Roadshow is a lot of fun. I hope everybody watches it. And a lot of these type of stories that I go through, I do a podcast called Brattlecast. If you go on Apple or any of the cast or go to our website, it's there. I've got over 100 episodes out. They're like 20 minutes. I just tell stories like this, and I can go on and on and on. Now, one of the things I will mention about doing question and answer, and some people sent in appraisals, is usually I can't get everything answered. It takes too much time, or I also, no matter what anybody asks me, I can go off on a tangent. And so we get to them. But if there are any questions coming in, they'll be filtered. But if anyone wants to get in touch with me by email, by phone, come into the store with either things to appraise or so on, feel free to do it after, any day or whatever. I will always answer. And one of the things that I always say is, if you ask somebody a question who loves what they're doing, usually the problem isn't getting an answer. It's usually getting them to stop answering. So, like I say, I can go on and on, but I have 3 or 4 more stories saved up. I have 2 or 3 appraisals that I'll do. But why don't we see if there's some questions? And if there are some, I'll go off on my tangents. And if there aren't any, I'll just keep telling stories.
There's one so far.
Okay.
Ricky and Bruce asked, they said they have hundreds of stereoscopic slides, many of Boston, and they wonder if they're of any value.
Well, the question is, I don't know whether all of you know what stereoscopic slides are. They started in around the 1860s, around the Civil War. Those are very rare. And they ran up until about World War I. And they were these pictures. Maybe some of you, when you were little kids, had those little Viewmasters that you could click and things would be 3D. Well, these were single things. You put them in a viewer and everything would be 3D. And the people do collect them. Now, the ones around World War I, and the reason they stopped using them as much, they used to be a real area of entertainment. But when movies started to get popular, they were the next thing. But you could see the world, they had all sorts of subjects and areas, and some of the subjects would be much better. Now, if you had told me you had a whole bunch of baseball players, those would be worth a fortune because it would be baseball collectors who would want them. Whereas if you have views of Europe and scenes that everybody traveled to, maybe a little less so. If they showed people working in cotton fields, either slavery or just after slavery, those are collectible. So it depends on value, depends a little bit on how old they are, what condition they're in, and also what period they're from exactly. Now, uh, if a lot of the slides are from Boston, I particularly like slides from Boston because I'm here, and most of them sell in the few dollar range. Like I say, if you have them old enough or the right subjects, they can sell into the hundreds of dollars. Uh, it depends on looking at them. And sometimes people have thousands of them. So it depends on which ones they are, what they are, and then we can get more detailed.
We have one more question here. John Collins asks, what are some of the most important things to look at to determine if an old book is valuable?
Well, that's a common question. You know, how do you tell if a book is valuable, or what do you look for? First of all, I'll answer this very generally, and then I'll get a little bit more specific. Let's say many times that question comes up when someone's either inherited a library or inherited a book or found something or been given something that they didn't collect. Because usually the collectors have some sense or idea of what they're getting. But photographs are one of the best ways nowadays, just the spines. Usually we can look at those and tell what might be good. And we might say, well, the third book from the right, you need to look. So you can always ask. And that's, you know, somebody who knows what they're doing. And what that does is, even if you're not sure that you trust the person, and I'm going to talk about an appraisal that came up once that was an extreme example of that. But even if you're not sure, at least we can narrow it down and say, look, spend your time looking up this one, this one, this one, and this one. Those really don't. Usually things you can look for, though. Condition. People like books in the original condition they came in, as good that condition can be. So usually the condition makes a difference, but there are exceptions. Everything I'm going to say, there are exceptions. So I suggest always asking. If it's a work of literature, usually the books early in their writing career are more valuable than later. Let's take someone like Stephen King. His first book or two, nobody knew who Stephen King was. And they printed relatively smaller editions. Nobody paid attention. So his earliest books like Carrie, Salem's Lot can be more valuable. Whereas later in his career, he's a best-selling author. So they're huge numbers. And those tend to be not as valuable because there's lots of them and people will collect them. An extreme case of that is Harry Potter. The first edition of the first Harry Potter book in London, which is only a little over 20 years old, can sell for $50,000 to $100,000. Nobody expected it to be popular. Nobody expected it to sell. So there weren't many copies, and the copies that did come out were read by children, and they were read to pieces. So to get one is almost impossible. Whereas by the time you get to her last book, there were 10 million first editions, and they'll probably never be valuable. Another thing you can look for is the book. If let's say it's some sort of historical book or on a particular subject, is it contemporary to when the subject was? In other words, a book on the American Revolution done in the 1970s is 200 years after. It might be a perfectly good book, but it's not old compared to the American Revolution. A book done in the 1770s on the American Revolution is old. The same way if it's a book on a scientific discovery and exploration, if it's contemporary to when it's done, usually that's a little bit better. And then obviously if they're beautifully leather bound or beautifully illustrated, or, you know, Picasso did signed lithographs in it, there are a lot of things that can make it, but usually the earlier in the author's career, the more contemporary in the condition, some of the things to check.
Another question came in wondering, is eBay a reasonably accurate way to assess the value of a book?
Well, there are a lot of other online. There's a thing called ABE Books. There's a site called BookFind. There are many online things in addition to eBay. Yes and no. All of those are tools. And if you know how to use the tools, they're very, very helpful. I always use the example that a toolkit of a cabinet maker, they can make a beautiful cabinet. give me that same toolkit, then chances are I'll pound my thumb with the hammer. So it's the same way with books. These online things have huge amounts of information, but they're unedited. So the person putting that information up might not know what they're talking about. One of the things that I always tell people when they do look up online, and that's sort of where that question goes, the first thing to look for is not what the value or what the books are listed for. The first thing is look and see how many. Because if you start getting 10, 20, 50, 100 copies of that book online, it means there's 10, 20, 50, 100 copies that haven't sold at any of those prices. Also, what it tends to do is also brings it down to the lowest common denominator. Because if they're all about the same condition, people come into me and say, well, we saw it online, at $100. And then I'll ask, well, did you see any others? And they said, well, yeah, well, that's sort of the average. There was some on at $20.50 and some on at $200 or $300. So we figured 100 was right. I said, if you were buying the book and they were all about the same, would you pay the $100 or would you pay the $20? So it tends to bring it down. So it's a good indication. It gives you some sense of how common the book is. As you get more experience, it's a great tool, but it's not perfect. And again, it might be something that you use to try to start sorting things out. And then I suggest asking somebody who really knows, but at least you can narrow it down.
Now,
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, since it's about 10 of, I'm going to do a couple of the people who send in appraisals, and then I'm going to, well, actually, what I'm going to do is tell the stories, because part of when people look things up online, one of the things that part of that does, and I advise people to bet as much knowledge you can get is good, but a lot of people do it because they don't really believe what we're going to say. And there was an extreme case of that. This was an appraisal my wife was doing. My wife works here too, more behind the scenes than me, but she works here. It's very much a family business. One time someone brought her in a book, and and the person was happy about it. She goes, "This book is signed by A. Lincoln." And what you do in a lot of the cases, you take the book, you look at it, you make sure that for someone, you get giving the person your attention. And my wife tries very nicely to say, yes, this book is signed by A. Lincoln, but it's just not the A. Lincoln we want it both to be. And the lady, wasn't happy. She goes, well, how can you tell? And my wife says, well, the first clue is, and she turns the page, this book was printed in 1915. And the lady goes, so? And my wife goes, well, my understanding is that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. Lady slammed it closed, goes, you don't know what you're talking about, and stormed out. So you can never make everybody happy. In any case, why don't I go? One of the books that was sent in by someone named Jim, he had a book from 1817 called The Imperial Captive by John William. And it's in good condition, leather bound, 1817. It's a poem about Napoleon being captive on the islands. And it's a horrible poem. It's been reprinted many times. There are almost no copies available. It's a book that's probably worth a few $100s. The problem sometimes with the book, and it's a very rare book, the problem sometimes with a book that's a very rare book is the people who want it are even rarer. So it's in the few hundreds of dollars. Looking at it from a book dealer's point of view, yeah, if I buy it and I put it on my shelf, maybe Jim could come back and visit it every year or two and it'd still be on my shelves. You never know, but it's actually an interesting thing of poetry. Whoever printed it and wrote it probably were fairly well off, because it wouldn't surprise me if they paid to have it printed and it didn't sell that well. a lot of times when people get books, and someone named Debbie sent this in, and they had a book called Alpha Bestiary, and it was by a man named John Chiati, who was a poet and a linguist. And so what he was doing was taking the alphabet, putting it with animals, and doing very nice illustrations. And this, I believe, now she hopefully is listening. If there's a edition of it that's 100 copies, signed and limited, and then there's a general edition. And if it's the signed and limited copies, they're beautiful engravings. They have to be in absolutely perfect condition, because when people collect limited edition books, they want them perfect. But it can sell for $300, $400, $500. If it's the regular edition, it's $20 or $30. But it's a gorgeous book. People collect that type of thing, and it's nice. One of the things that we actually get called on, and Ellen sent this in, they're talking about a Blue Jackets manual. And a lot of people have heard about Blue Jackets manual, because when you, especially around World War II, and this is a copy from 1940, so just as the US was about to enter, and it's what officers were supposed to do on ships, and it listed it. The thing is, at that time, the men and women in the service ballooned, so there were lots of copies, and books on World War II were very good sellers up until about 20, 25 years ago. Now, probably every third or fourth house we get called to, someone says, well, my father or my mother had a collection of books on World War II, which is great, except for the problem is that generation is the one who bought them. The generations now who are buying books aren't as interested. They still are very good books, and some still do very well, but it's just generational. So they don't sell it. So that's probably a $10 book. What I'm going to do is I'm going to end just telling one last story about appraisals and books. And like I say, I can go on and on and on with this, and it's a lot of fun. It's almost like being Jim Hawkins on Treasure Island every day, never knowing who you're going to meet, what you're going to see. We're just in the process. A man called me 3 weeks ago and said his cousin died in a suburb just north of Boston, and they had about 500 books on sports and mysteries. And we got to the house. It was a big Tudor house. There was an immaculate lawn and beautiful flower beds. We get in the house, and the man had been a hoarder. He a very neat hoarder. He had 20,000 books. And I looked at the cousin and I said, he said, well, look, when we first got in this house, you couldn't even see the walls, but it went from 500 to 20,000. And I always point out to people, if you buy 20,000 books in a house, you've got to move 20,000 books in a house. And people think we sit there and read books all day. It's an incredibly physical job. And one of the things that all my employees are absolutely hoping that this COVID will ease, and it seems to be, because try carrying 100 boxes of books down 3 flights of stairs while you're wearing a mask. It is horrible. I've sweated through them. In any case, one last story. I got called to a large old church in Boston, and it was a beautiful church. Like I say, well over 100 years old. They just over the years had accumulated books. They had a huge library. They wanted me in there to figure out if they had any, rare books. Spent a day there, and they actually had some good ones. At the end of the day, the priest said to me, could you come down the basement? There were a few more books. Went down the basement. There were a few more books, looked at them. And then off in a corner was a closet. Actually, it was more like a small room. The priest opened the door, front to back, floor to ceiling, top to bottom. It was stuffed with thousands of old Bibles. And I looked at the priest and I said, well, what is this? He says, well, people hate to throw away a book. They feel it's sacrilegious to throw away a Bible. So what happens when a parishioner dies and the family doesn't want the Bible? they come and they present it to the church. And he said, what do? We very graciously accept it. We don't want to offend anybody. Then we go downstairs, open the door, put it in with the rest of them. And he goes, and we can't drive a dumpster up to the back of the church and fill it full of Bibles. That would just be terrible. So I use it as an example to say that if you want to give something to a charity, ask them if they want it first. If they want it and can use it, it's great. But if all you're doing is taking your old junk, you're really not doing anyone a favor. Like I say, I'm going to end things. I get to work very early. But if anybody didn't get their questions in, if they have any other appraisals, if they have questions about books or just want to chat, email, phone, mail, come in. As like I say, myself and the people who work here, we love what we do. It's getting us to stop answering more than answers the problem. So thank you all for showing up.
Thank you, Ken. The last question someone did ask is,
Okay, sure. Why don't
if
we
there are
get
any
it?
other hot collectible, what are the hot collectibles this year in 2021? What is hot?
Well, it's sort of hard to say, but almost everything is hot. But it's what you love and what you like. But a few of the things, a lot of things have changed from Victorian. In other words, people used to decorate these leather bindings. A lot of things now are sort of the mid-century, the 1950s. Antique dealers will talk about old brown furniture. It used to be very collectible. It's not as much now, but people want the 1950s style. So books on cocktails from the 1950s and drinks, those are very popular now. Things that might have been just a few dollars 20 years ago now are selling at $100, $200. A lot of the literature, not so much the Hemingways and Faulkners are falling off, but the things like Stephen King, John Grisham, their earlier novels, or To Kill a Mockingbird, sort of that the books that someone who are now in their 50s to 70s grew up on. Those are the ones that, because it brings back the memories of their childhood. I'll tell you one that might even surprise people. Some of the old classics, though, people are a first edition of Make Way for Ducklings. Children's books are very popular in absolutely perfect condition. Now, the two types of books that are the hardest to get in perfect condition are cookbooks because of the way they're used, and children's books by who use them. But Make Way for Ducklings, mint copy. So many of us grew up on it, can sell for $20,000. Take the dust jacket off, not a good copy, it might be 100 or two. But so things generationally in that respect. One area that I always tell people that I think are sort of going to be the collecting of the future, it is now, but even more so, two subjects that I love. Now, these are me, space exploration and computer computer intelligence and all that goes with that. I think the first men going to the moon are going to be much like Francis Drake and Magellan and Columbus 200-300 years from now. They'll look back on those. And of course, then I'll be selling them for more at that time because I plan on being here. In any case, thank you all.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it. I'll go home, but I'll be here early tomorrow morning. And I do answer the phone early in the morning.
Very good. Well, thank you. We really appreciate all your stories and your insights. And just to let everybody else know, the Westboro Historical Society's next activity is going to be our Spring Bazaar and Yard Sale, which is going to take place Saturday, June 5th from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. at the Sibley House, 13 Parkman Street in Westboro. So come and hunt for some treasures. I don't know if we'll have books, but we'll have some treasures there.
And I'll throw in one more thing. If you like the stories, Brattlecast for the podcast. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ken. Thank you, everyone.
Okay,
We
bye.
really appreciate it. Thank you and have a good evening.
Everybody, the same to you.